You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always. This week, we're dipping back into the regional property market of Western Australia with my favourite man to chat about this stuff. It's Brendon Ptolomey, Managing Director of Heron Todd White. Brendo, thanks for coming in, mate.
Trent, great to be here. Thanks for having me, mate.
Hey, it was an interesting chat about the Perth property market. We're hitting records every week in that space. The regional market, though, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on whether that's translating across the regions or whether it's patchy like a few months ago in some of the northern parts compared to the southern parts.
Yeah, this is really interesting, I reckon, and obviously why we do the catch-up on a quarterly basis. So I hope this doesn't sound like we're just replicating the Perth Metro conversation, but I hope everyone will recall that when we talked about, say, Dunsborough and Busselton in the last pod, there was a little bit of a pause there. We talked about the fact that a little bit of supply came back to the market. Everyone hesitated slightly. Maybe it was just the summer holidays. People were less active in terms of really putting their foot on a transaction and going for it. What we're now seeing is that Southwest market across a few different segments there is definitively following the Perth Metro market. It is in desperation stakes in terms of what are you going to buy. Just as an example, we talked about Dunsborough Lakes. Remember, we were talking about the fact that a couple of things had stalled on the market, and we're talking about purchase prices at $800,000-$900,000 for a good quality single residential 4x2 in a cul-de-sac, or maybe even a view of the golf course. We're now seeing multiple sales in there at $1.4 million. They've got views, so they do have view over lakes and those kinds of things. But I just want everyone to stop and think, this is a single residential, single story, 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom house. It's absolutely neat as a pin, but that's the type of product we're talking about. That's
we're paying mid-ones in Dunsborough Lakes.
Absolutely. I knew you would love that story. The type of sale that as valuers, and I've got two of these, then almost in the same street. So it's not a one-off. It's not someone that's flunked in from the East Coast and paid too much. There's a trend there for sure. And it's the type of sale that gets our valuers going in terms of walking around the office going, look, I've just done a purchase price. Can you see this number? This is crazy.
Value's doubled in that space in 5 years.
I'd be pretty happy to agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. It's pretty crazy. 5 years ago, you would have easily bought a $500,000 neat and tidy 4x2 in a good street within Dunsborough Lakes, and that's going to cost you $900,000 to $1 million now.
Yeah, wow. Well, that's probably the kickoff point for this conversation. We'll start in slightly cheaper parts of the world with one of my pet loves, Mandurah and the Mandurah area.
Yep.
We've had a couple of questions offline from the Perth Property Show just about trying to understand the capacity for growth in the area.
Yep.
And I found that, again, quite self-defeatist. They've obviously gone through a lot of pain in the last 20 years since 2006 peaks. But we know that prices in Mandurah are still well below replacement cost at every price point in the local government area, whether it's in the canals in Hall's Head or all the way down to your Falcon Wannanup, Dudley Parks sort of area too. And because of that affordability factor, there's still a considerable amount of people moving to that Rockingham and, as an extension, Mandurah region. And I would have to ask, why would there be any suggestion of prices even stabilising in that area, given the dynamics we're seeing across the rest of the state?
Yeah, so I would suggest that this becomes the ripple effect in terms of where people start to look. So they've started with a price band, maybe back up towards, say, Baldivis, and then working down into Waikiki and Warnbro and Port Kennedy. And so then you start going, okay, I can't afford this anymore. Do I work down the line? Same as in terms of working out from Mandurah. So I just thought maybe I'd give you a quick example of actual value growth. So just bear in mind that all over Perth, we're seeing 30, 40, 50% value growth over a couple of years. We've got an example in Lakelands just to the north of Mandurah there, and essentially it's an increase of nearly 25%. So value that went from June 2023 transaction of $550,000 to an April 2024 transaction at $680,000. So nice and neat 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with a double garage on 529 square metres. And really what I'm telling you this story is the value growth is there. So if you're sitting around Mandurah and its circumferences, either north, south or east, and wondering whether it will go up in value, that's showing you that over the last 10 months there's been a 23.5% increase in value in a northern part of or northern suburb of Mandurah, essentially.
And we're still very much in the affordability space here when it comes to our average incomes.
Absolutely. And so if we work downwards, as in back towards Mandurah from that Lakelands example, I would expect you're going to find some opportunity below the median house price at that 550, in particular if you have a smaller block and a slightly smaller house, from Lakelands back down into Mandurah and Mandurah itself.
And then you ask the question, well, house prices only stabilise if supply can meet demand. Now, we know demand is obviously rampant in the area, both from a rental and a sales point of view. Where is supply coming from? Well, the Florida estate development in Dawesville is pretty much sold out. Tucky Cove, pretty much sold out. There's stuff going on in Carnup. And a bit of satellite developments around the north side of Mandurah. But other than that, there are no apartment buildings being built.
No.
There are no new land estates being developed.
Yep.
Where's the supply going to come from to help soften prices in the Mandurah area? I don't see it happening.
No, neither do I. And we go back to that. The city of Mandurah really proactive in terms of rezoning that circumference of the inner city to R60s and 80s and 100s for big blocks. Unfortunately, it hasn't been feasible for them to be constructed on.
Price is not high enough.
Yeah. So the end value wasn't going to make it viable for a developer to do that. So even though that council was really proactive, we haven't ended up with that supply. And so yet again, we ended up in this situation where there's not a supply of housing options to create the churn in the marketplace and give people an option to get in.
Bunbury has been the poster child over and above even Dunsborough in the last year or so when it comes to percentage growth, probably again because of price points.
Yeah, so again, you work into an affordability situation here. Talking to the team, actually, some of the examples that they pulled out there, and we're probably talking slightly different lifestyle opportunity, i.e. you go from Bunbury into Australind, but we're seeing some really decent value growth in Australind and are starting to see some pretty crazy numbers. So houses that have previously sold in 2021 at $530,000 and they're now reselling for $800,000. It's another really similar example that's resold at $710,000. So that's a 61% increase on that one. The previous example is a 53% increase. And then just to give you the Dunsborough Lakes type example in Australind, there's a sale there at $1.03 million for decent sized house on a decent sized block. But we had a little look at this sale. It's up 58% from its previous selling point, which was essentially $600,000 in March 2021. Hold that thought, $600,000 March 2021. The previous sale was the previous peak of the market, which was January 2007. This same property transacted at $820,000. So go on that roller coaster ride, $820,000 in 2007, down to $600,000 in March 2021. And between March 21 and March 24, it's gone from $600,000 back up to $1,030,000.
So we're breaking those historical highs.
So yeah, I thought you'd like that example because we're going past that previous peak.
This is where I think we've well and truly seen that across every sector of West Australia's market now, except for still probably that apartment market in East Perth and West Perth, where we actually haven't reached those 2012 prices yet of a lot of those apartments. Again, we spoke about that in the Perth market update. But certainly across the southwest, where we've seen just as much of a dip in some areas like your Mandurahs, it's pretty much gotten to that point with most segments now where we've broken those mining boom highs if it had dropped from them.
And just to pick up on your Bunbury point again, so because the REWA stats actually bear this out, we don't have to look too much further than that. Southwest median house price was $374,000 in 2019. And it's now $536,000, so 43% increase in the median house price in those 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Okay, well, that shows to me that demand-supply fundamentals are just like Perth, especially in Bunbury, just a smaller version of Perth, smaller prices than Perth, more capacity for growth if the demand-supply fundamentals remain the same, which we know doesn't get any easier in Bunbury than it is in Perth.
Yeah, exactly. And local economy is really strong, obviously, so that's underpinning the demand in that location. Yeah.
You want to go back to Dunsborough Bustleton and talk a bit deeper?
Yeah, so just really interesting to reflect on the fact that the market felt like it paused. It felt like it paused from the bottom to the top as well. And then the other headline coming out of there is not dissimilar to Perth Metro, and that is that the people that are missing out on established homes are going back to land, and land prices have increased. So,
and where is the land in the Dunsborough Bustleton area?
So there's a little bit left in Dunsborough Lakes, but then you have to come back up to Vass. The joke around the office is that values on land are going up in the Vass section because the new Bunbury Farmers Market's going to be through there, so everyone wants to be walking distance to collect their fresh fruit and vegetables, their homemade pies and
Doesn't sound like a
whatever
joke to me,
else.
Brendon. Sounds like a very smart idea.
Sounds like a good lifestyle. Might hurt the waistline, who knows? But so just to give everyone an example, 540 square metre lots in there that were around about $240,000 6 months ago, they've now jumped up to $300,000. Again, this is the conversations that are happening amongst our valuers in the office. So they're going back, might have not done a job in there for a month. They come back through and find a new contract and start ringing their colleagues saying, hey, this is at 300 grand for this new sale on this lot. Is that where we're peaking?
Yeah,
at?
what the?
Yeah, exactly. So when really, again, I'm just trying to let the audience know, when a valuer is surprised by a number, it means that the market's moved really quickly.
Just to that point, and we didn't speak to this in the Metro update, I've heard a little bit from sales agents of pushback from some valuers on prices recently in some areas, some around Rockingham, for example. Are we seeing that in the Southwest, and are you seeing that in your firm? What's the theme at the moment? Are you causing issues for the transactions in WA, or are you essentially putting your swords down and going, yep, this is what it is?
Yeah, and I know no one wants to listen to our tiny violin, but it's a really difficult market to value in, and in particular where you get one-off standout sales, and they're the scenarios that you'd be alluding to there. We would always investigate who the purchaser is. If it's an East Coast investor and a buyer agent's involved and they've suddenly jumped from listing price of $1 million and it's suddenly gone to 1.5, or I know it's a slightly ridiculous scenario, but that's the kind of scenario we're looking for where they're one-offs. What we will do in our reports as valuers, and what we should be doing, is essentially calling out the fact that we think it's at the top of the market, as in it's at the upper end of the value range at that point in the market.
But that's not to say that it would drop from there, though, would it?
No. So we're just saying, look, we're valuing this on the day that we inspect the property. That's the valuation date.
And this is overs.
Yeah, and the sales evidence that we've got is suggesting that this is high. And so then in our bank finance valuation reports, the API Property Pro reports, they essentially have a risk rating in there where we can reflect our thoughts. So we might, for the current market section, we might be saying, we think the market's overheated. We think that people are starting to pay too much for property, but we're happy that the value is there because it's a transaction between a willing buyer and a willing seller.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we've seen that a number of times in WA right now, where you'd have a nervous valuer looking at a new price point and then 10 more above that coming in the next month anyway.
Yeah. And for all the brokers listening, all the bankers listening, like, that doesn't mean we're not going to knock back the contracts that we think where purchasers are getting overzealous, or when you look at that definition of market value, they're not informed about the market they're operating in and they try and pay too much.
Let's talk the Albany market. It seems to be becoming a cooler place to live these days, not only comparative to the heat we've had over our long summer, but also just getting a little bit more coverage. A lot more of my mates seem to be heading down there for a holiday over the last few years. Albany seems like a lovely place to go if you're looking for the price point and a quiet place to exist. Don't you think?
Trent,
did I sell that well?
Yes, you did. Yeah, the city of Albany will be sending you a case of wine or something. That's actually really close to the feedback that we've got from our valuer base down in the Great Southern, essentially saying a lot of contracts coming with Perth addresses on there. So they might be feeling a little bit like some Perth suburbs with the East Coast investors. Still a lot of money coming out of the Perth market into Albany. I think that tree change, location change, I know we're still on the coast down there, incredibly beautiful coastline through Denmark and into Albany, obviously. I think there's a lot of working from home in this one. So essentially people probably working out that, say, if we think about long weekends and Easter and those types of timeframes, I think what people are now able to do is they'll travel the day before. They'll spend longer at their holiday home, and they understand that they can only do this really if they own the place. They've got their great internet set up, and they can go and leave work a day or two before the rush and spend more time in those locations that they feel like they're on holiday in. Yeah, that's still driving the values up. The concern from our valuer down there is a lot around, essentially we're getting way beyond replacement cost now. So then you flip back to what we talked about in the Perth market for a while. Maybe you're better off trying to find a block of land, which is still really difficult in Albany. There are some locally based builders. If they've got supply and able to handle it, then potentially you're back at block and build type scenario as well.
The interesting thing about Albany, if you look at on a satellite, is that there's still quite a lot of sort of vacant old blocks around, but no real land estates where people are actively selling land.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of blocks that are subdivisible, but not many people subdividing.
Yeah.
So it just seems like a lot of landlocked property there, old money probably, where, as you said, it's strange that the market's getting above replacement costs, but there's not really that many opportunities to build if you wanted to.
Yeah, and so that becomes that scenario where people are just looking for an opportunity to weigh in, and so they find that cheaper opportunity. In particular with land, they might think, well, I don't have to worry about the maintenance and that kind of stuff. I'll build a brand new house. Then they stagnate in terms of getting that development off the ground. Or from the locals' point of view, they've got no desperation and no interest in changing their patch, i.e. they're not going to subdivide their 2,000 square metre block, even though they've got lots of room, because they just don't need to change it. And then the feasibility of it's probably quite questionable as well.
Now let's go to Kalgoorlie. I don't have a lot of visibility of Kalgoorlie at the moment, although I haven't heard a lot of good things or bad things about that market. It seems to just be ticking along. What's going on?
A little bit like we're talking about with Dunsborough, a lot of interest flooding back into that market, still going really strong. Plenty of investor activity, and interestingly, lots of owner-occupier activity, which is probably what's changed since the last time we talked about it. So essentially what we're seeing is the owner-occupiers get out of where they were and essentially upgrading. A lot of transactions sitting around the 700K mark, so decent quality houses on decent sized blocks. Obviously there's still some really cheap product through Kalgoorlie and over into Boulder and those kinds of locations where investors might be interested. The headline coming out of there for mine in terms of talking to our local Kalgoorlie valuer is that no one, in talking to the local agents and even just talking to owner-occupiers and tenants, no one is really too worried about the BHP nickel smelter potentially closing. It's been a big headline. Obviously, BHP are working through a process. From a property point of view, you hear about 2,000 potential job losses in a cyclical town like Kalgoorlie, and you start worrying really quickly about whether house prices are going to fall off a cliff. And right now, the confidence is really high in both investor segment and owner-occupier segment. Interesting that there's been a couple of transactions over $1 million in there, and what we're seeing there is owner-occupiers that essentially have the equity and the cash built up, can obviously sell their lower value property, move to the higher value property, and then what they're doing then is looking to renovate those because they're slightly dated.
$1 million in Kalgoorlie?
Yep, multiple transactions over $1 million, yeah.
Where are those?
Close to the golf course. There's actually an estate on the edge of the airport, which sounds a bit weird, but it's just big blocks and decent quality homes. They're now getting slightly dated, so there's a bit of cosmetic renovation happening through those locations as well, which is really interesting. Yeah.
But I mean, properties in Kalgoorlie historically over the last, just a few years ago, you could buy stuff for $200,000-$300,000.
And so, it's interesting to watch the wealth of the population evolve there, and a lot more potentially the people being paid to work on the mining areas around Kalgoorlie settle into town. Litmus test from our local valuer in Kalgoorlie was that a new seafood restaurant has opened up in Cal, obviously locally caught fish.
Yes.
And the seafood platter for two is $400 a pop there. So if we're talking about cost of living and people going to spend disposable income, there you go.
Well, lucky I don't like seafood.
There's a litmus test for you.
Let's head up north. The last time we chatted, the one market that wasn't doing as well as it had previously or as well as the rest of the pack was Broome.
It's bumping along similar to last time. No standouts there for us in terms of change in activity, other than some press around actually some FIFO type flights to be planned out of there. So we're hearing rumours that Mineral Resources would begin. So, just bear in mind we're only flying down the road, but it is a fairly long way down the road from Broome in the Kimberleys down into those Pilbara mining towns and mine sites, at least an hour or so on a plane, just for listeners that might not know the geography of WA. So that would be a really interesting proposition. If you could live as a FIFO worker in Broome and get a direct connection to your place of work, which doesn't happen at this point in time, that's a real opportunity for the location of Broome. Just to touch on that for the southwest, and it's probably a driver because we talked about Australind earlier on, and for Bunbury, I'm hearing that Rio announced flying about 2,000 workers a week out of Busso into their mine sites, and other miners now want to catch up on that scenario as well.
Yeah, it's probably a big hidden beast that we haven't been speaking about recently as well. Finally, let's look at the big guys, South Hedland and Karratha. 3 or 4 years ago, they were the shining light. Rents were rising at massive paces. Price growth was rising back in boom time again. And really, we haven't heard anything in the news, in data points. No one's talking about Karratha or South Hedland, up or down. They've come right out of sight, really, haven't they? Does that mean that their market's softened, or it's just ticking along?
It hasn't softened, so definitively let everyone know that it's not going backwards. It is back into a regional type cycle in terms of they have stock that comes to the market, gets soaked up, There's a lot of flurry of activity, and that's happening right now. A bit of stock goes maybe a little bit stale in the market. Everyone kind of looks at it, stands back and goes, oh, am I going to do this? Am I going to buy the investment property, or am I going to upgrade, or am I going to move to town? And then one property will sell, and then the domino will work through the market for a phase of maybe a month or two. And that's happening through June as we speak, in terms of some of the stock being cleaned up, flurry of activity. The prices don't get a whole lot of pressure because I think the market understands that there'll be some volume that will fill that void once that part of the market's sold out in this phase. And so then it continues to tick along. So
we're at a natural balance at the moment.
I think it's probably not far off being that natural type balance. And I think that we need to remember that it was in line with some of the first Perth suburbs to go. It had headlines because the values went up really quickly again.
They were the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, absolutely. So it got that front page news. And then Port Hedland and South Hedland is probably not too dissimilar. Port it's stymied a little bit at the moment, a little bit of uncertainty about some of the buyback activity through there and the future plans for the port and the conversion to industrial land use and those kinds of things on the northern side of the port there. And then South Hedland is essentially churning, but and similar to K-Town, doesn't have that price pressure on it. Yeah.
Let's swing around, mate. Let's start heading back to Perth. We stop off overnight in Geraldton. What's going on in our favourite market?
Yeah, so really interesting that rents are really, really strong up there. We don't do a huge amount of this type of work, but doing like rental dispute type work on single residential houses. So essentially rents going from about $500 a week to $600 a week, dramatic jump. Essentially a couple of business type tenants involved in that house. And so having a bit of a dispute over whether that's actually correct, and then getting us involved and us actually having to do a valuation to say, hey, look, the rent is actually now at high fives and you're within reason to ask for an increase. Investors are still really, really chasing returns through there. So there still looks cheap in relation to other WA properties. So there'll be buyer agents that are looking around Perth Metro, Southwest, Albany, Karratha and going, okay, sorry, Gero's a whole lot cheaper. And so I'll take my customer to Geraldton. Interestingly, those gross yields aren't absolutely hitting it out of the park. We're still talking actually Perth Metro type yields. Gross yields of 5.5%, 6%. They're not the Northwest yields of up to 10+%. So that's interesting. Then you get back to that affordability side of things, i.e. I'm going to go buy there because I can buy a single residential dwelling on 1,000 square metres that rents at $600 a week. And then interestingly, as we've been talking about in other locations, technical term, land sales have picked up massively. So 2024, it sounds like it's the year of buying up the vacant land up there.
Super cheap land up there.
Yeah, and I was just going to go back to, so if you were, again, looking around at your options, even if you live in town, suddenly the local market has swung from established dwellings being really affordable to being more expensive and nearly getting prohibitive. Right, I'll go buy a block of land because that's still inexpensive.
Brendon, it's been an interesting conversation again about what is still a very strong market regionally with a little bit of modulation. I think that's why it's important to always update yourself with these quarterly regional updates. What it does, it just makes sure that if you do have something that is generally a slightly riskier product, being in a regional market, you know what's going on, your fingers on the pulse, and this is how you do it. Thank you very much, Brendon, for coming in. We'll do it again in 3 months.
Thanks, Trent. Enjoyed our fly around Western Australia. Cheers, man.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!